The morning sun blazed mercilessly over the Florida Keys, turning the sand into a furnace beneath Jake Morrison's bare feet. He squinted through his camera viewfinder, adjusting the focus on a weathered piece of driftwood that had caught his eye. The Atlantic stretched endlessly before him, its turquoise waters deceptively calm under the August heat of 1973. Jake had been photographing the Keys for National Geographic, documenting the delicate ecosystem before development inevitably changed it forever. At 32, he'd built a reputation capturing nature's raw beauty. But lately, something felt different about this assignment. The isolation was getting to him, or maybe it was the locals' strange reluctance to discuss certain areas of the coastline. He lowered his Nikon and wiped sweat from his forehead. The beach stretched empty in both directions, save for the occasional pelican diving for fish. This particular stretch of Islamorada had been recommended by his editor as untouched paradise, but there was something unsettling about its perfection. Too quiet, too pristine. A glint of something caught his peripheral vision. Half buried in the sand near the tide line lay what appeared to be a piece of debris. Jake approached cautiously, his photographer's instincts kicking in. Whatever it was had been here for some time, judging by the way the sand had formed small dunes around it. He knelt and carefully brushed away the grains, revealing the corner of what looked like a photograph. His pulse quickened. Finding old photos washed ashore wasn't uncommon, but they rarely survived the salt water and sun long enough to remain intact. Using his lens cleaning brush, Jake gently excavated the photograph. It was larger than he'd expected, perhaps 5 by 7 inches, and surprisingly well preserved despite obvious water damage. The edges were curled and stained, but the image itself remained clear. What he saw made him sit back on his heels in shock. The photograph was in black and white, clearly from an earlier era, judging by the grain and composition. It showed a young man in what appeared to be military flight gear, his face pale and drawn with what could only be described as absolute terror. The man clutched something in his right hand, and Jake squinted to make out the details. It was a compass, but not just any compass. This one was heavily corroded, its face cracked and needle frozen at an impossible angle. But it was the man's eyes that truly disturbed Jake. They seemed to stare directly through the camera lens, wide with a fear so profound it transcended the boundaries of the photograph itself. There was something else in those eyes too, a desperate pleading, as if the man was trying to communicate some urgent warning across the decades. Jake turned the photograph over, his hands trembling slightly. In faded blue ink, someone had written, "Lieutenant Charles Taylor, Flight 19, December 5th, 1945. God help us all." The blood drained from Jake's face. Every American knew the story of Flight 19, the squadron of 5 Navy torpedo bombers that had vanished without a trace in the Bermuda Triangle. Lieutenant Charles Taylor had been the flight leader, an experienced pilot who'd somehow become disoriented during what should have been a routine training mission. The last radio transmission from Flight 19 had been Taylor's voice, crackling with static and confusion. "We can't find west. Everything is wrong. We can't be sure of any direction. Everything looks strange, even the ocean." 14 men had disappeared that day, their aircraft swallowed by the mysterious waters off the Florida coast. The official investigation had blamed pilot error and weather conditions, but the case had spawned decades of speculation about the supernatural properties of the Bermuda Triangle. And now Jake held what appeared to be photographic evidence that at least one member of Flight 19 had survived long enough after the disappearance to be photographed. But that was impossible. The search had been immediate and extensive. If any survivors had reached shore, they would have been found. Jake examined the photograph more closely, using his professional eye to analyze the details. The lighting appeared consistent with daylight, but there was something off about the shadows. They seemed to fall in multiple directions, as if illuminated by several light sources simultaneously. The background was indistinct, almost deliberately obscured, but he could make out what might have been water or sky. A sudden gust of wind swept across the beach, carrying with it the acrid smell of ozone and something else, something that reminded Jake of old leather and aviation fuel. He looked up at the cloudless sky, puzzled by the unexpected breeze. The air had been perfectly still moments before. As he tucked the photograph carefully into his camera bag, Jake felt an inexplicable chill despite the oppressive heat. The rational part of his mind insisted this had to be some kind of hoax or misidentification. People didn't survive plane crashes in the Bermuda Triangle, only to disappear again for nearly 3 decades. But as he walked back toward his rented car, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He turned several times, scanning the empty beach and the tree line beyond, but saw nothing. Still, the sensation persisted, raising goosebumps along his arms despite the sweltering temperature. The photograph seemed to pulse with its own energy in his bag, as if it were alive and aware of his possession. Jake quickened his pace, suddenly eager to get back to his hotel room, where he could examine his find more thoroughly under proper lighting. Behind him, though he didn't notice, the sand where the photograph had been buried began to swirl in a perfect circle, defying the gentle ocean breeze. And somewhere in the distance, barely audible above the lapping waves, came the faint drone of aircraft engines growing steadily closer. Jake's hands shook as he fumbled with the key to room 237 at the Coral Reef Motel. The two-story building had seen better days. Its pink stucco facade faded and cracked from years of salt air and hurricane seasons, but it was clean, cheap, and most importantly, it had a darkroom setup in the basement that the owner rented out to traveling photographers. Once inside his room, Jake immediately drew the heavy curtains and switched on the desk lamp. The air conditioning unit rattled to life, providing a welcome reprieve from the suffocating heat outside. He sat on the edge of the sagging bed and carefully removed the photograph from his camera bag, handling it as if it were made of spun glass. Under the harsh fluorescent light, the image seemed even more disturbing. Lieutenant Taylor's terrified expression appeared to shift slightly as Jake moved the photograph, an optical illusion that made his stomach churn. The rusted compass in the airman's grip looked ancient, far older than something from 1945 should appear. Jake reached for the phone on the nightstand and dialed information. After a brief conversation with the operator, he was connected to the Navy Historical Center in Washington, D.C. A crisp voice answered on the third ring. Historical Center, Petty Officer Martinez speaking. Hello, this is Jake Morrison. I'm a photographer working on assignment in the Florida Keys, and I've come across something that might be of interest to your department. I found what appears to be a photograph of Lieutenant Charles Taylor from Flight 19. There was a long pause. Sir, I'm going to transfer you to Commander Phillips. Please hold. Classical music filled the line for several minutes before another voice came on, older and more authoritative. Mr. Morrison, this is Commander Phillips. I understand you believe you found a photograph of Lieutenant Taylor. That's correct. It's clearly labeled with his name and the date, December 5th, 1945. The man in the photograph is wearing flight gear consistent with that period. Mr. Morrison, I need to tell you that we receive calls like this frequently. The Flight 19 incident has generated countless hoaxes and false artifacts over the years. However, I'm willing to take a look if you can provide some details about the photograph's condition and where you found it. Jake described the discovery and the photograph's appearance in detail. As he spoke, he noticed the room had grown noticeably colder despite the air conditioner's minimal output. His breath was beginning to form small clouds in the suddenly frigid air. That's unusually specific, Commander Phillips admitted. The detail about the compass is particularly interesting. Lieutenant Taylor's compass was indeed reported as malfunctioning during the flight. It was one of the factors that contributed to their disorientation. So this could be legitimate. I didn't say that, but I'd like you to bring the photograph to our facility for analysis. We have experts who can determine its age and authenticity through various scientific methods. Jake was about to respond when the lights in his room flickered. The fluorescent bulb above him began to strobe intermittently, casting wild shadows across the walls. The air conditioner's rattle had changed to something that sounded almost like distant radio static. Mr. Morrison, are you still there? Yes, sorry, the lights are acting up. When would you want to see the photograph? How soon can you get to Washington? This is the kind of thing we prefer to handle quickly, before word gets out to conspiracy theorists and treasure hunters. The static from the air conditioner was growing louder, and Jake could swear he heard voices buried within the white noise, faint, distorted voices that seemed to be calling out coordinates and compass headings. I can probably drive up tomorrow, Jake said, raising his voice above the increasing static. But, Commander, there's something else. Since I found this photograph, I've been experiencing some unusual... The line went dead. Jake stared at the silent receiver, then noticed that the digital clock on the nightstand was flashing 12 miles repeatedly, as if the power had gone out and come back on, but the lights were still working, albeit flickering more violently now. He hung up the phone and turned his attention back to the photograph. In the unstable lighting, Lieutenant Taylor's face seemed to be moving, his mouth opening and closing as if trying to speak. Jake blinked hard and looked again, but the illusion persisted. The temperature in the room had dropped at least 20 degrees. Jake could see his breath clearly now, and frost was beginning to form around the edges of the window. This was impossible in the Florida heat, but the evidence was right in front of him. From somewhere outside his room came the unmistakable sound of aircraft engines, low and rhythmic, growing steadily louder. Jake rushed to the window and threw back the curtains, expecting to see a plane passing overhead. But the sky was empty, painted in the deep oranges and purples of sunset. The engine noise continued, seeming to circle the motel in a wide pattern. Other guests were emerging from their rooms, looking up at the sky with confused expressions. Jake could hear them talking in the parking lot below. "You hear that plane?" "What plane?" "I don't see anything. Sounds like it's right overhead." Jake pressed his face to the glass, scanning every inch of visible sky. Nothing. But the engine noise was unmistakable now, the distinct rumble of multiple aircraft in formation. As he listened, he began to pick out individual engines, at least 5 separate aircraft, all maintaining the same circular pattern around the motel. His hands trembling, Jake picked up the photograph again. Lieutenant Taylor's eyes seemed to lock onto his own, and for a terrifying moment, Jake could swear he heard a voice, faint but clear, rising above the phantom engine noise. "Can you hear me? We're still here. We've been here all along." Jake dropped the photograph and stumbled backward, his heart hammering against his ribs. The voice had come from the photograph itself, he was certain of it. But that was impossible. Photographs didn't speak, they didn't move, they didn't make rooms freeze over in the middle of a Florida summer. The aircraft engines reached a crescendo, so loud now that the windows were rattling in their frames. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the sound stopped. The temperature in the room immediately began to rise, and the lights steadied to their normal fluorescent glow. Jake stood in the sudden silence, sweat beading on his forehead despite the lingering cold. The photograph lay face down on the carpet where he'd dropped it. With extreme reluctance, he bent to pick it up, half expecting it to be blank or changed somehow. But Lieutenant Taylor stared back at him with the same terrified expression, the same desperate pleading in his eyes. Only now Jake thought he could see something else in that gaze, recognition, as if the airman knew exactly who was looking at him across the decades. Jake barely slept that night. Every creak of the old motel, every whistle of wind through the palm fronds outside his window, sent his nerves jangling. The photograph sat on the nightstand face down, but he could feel its presence like a weight pressing against his consciousness. Twice he'd gotten up to check if the image had changed, and twice Lieutenant Taylor's terrified face had stared back at him, unchanged. By dawn, Jake had made his decision. Before driving to Washington to meet with Commander Phillips, he needed to learn more about the local history. If the photograph was genuine, it meant Lieutenant Taylor had somehow survived the crash and made it to shore. Someone in the Keys might know something about what had happened next. The Islamorada Public Library was a small single-story building that looked like it had been constructed in the 1950s and hadn't been updated since. Jake pushed through the glass doors into the blessed coolness of air conditioning and approached the circulation desk. An elderly woman with silver hair and kind eyes looked up from a stack of returned books. "Can I help you, honey?" "I hope so. I'm researching the Flight 19 incident from 1945. I'm particularly interested in any local stories or accounts from that time period." The librarian's expression immediately grew guarded. "You're not the first person to come asking about that. Are you one of those triangle people? Because I'll tell you right now, we don't encourage that kind of talk around here." "No, nothing like that. I'm a photographer working on an assignment about the Keys. I came across something that might be connected to Flight 19, and I'm just trying to understand the historical context." She studied him for a long moment, then seemed to reach a decision. "My name's Helen Vasquez. I've been the librarian here for 32 years, and before that my father was the harbor master. If there are stories about Flight 19 in these parts, I've heard them all." "What kind of stories?" Helen glanced around the empty library, then leaned closer. "The kind we don't talk about with outsiders usually, but you seem genuine." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "There were sightings after the disappearance. Locals claimed they saw a man in pilot's gear wandering the beaches at night, always carrying something in his hand, always heading toward the water." Jake felt his pulse quicken. "When did these sightings occur?" "Started about a week after Flight 19 went missing. Lasted for months. My father was one of the people who saw him." Helen's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Said the man looked lost, confused, kept asking for directions to Fort Lauderdale, but when people tried to help him, he'd just disappear." "Disappear how?" "Like he was never there to begin with. but he'd leave footprints in the sand, and sometimes people found pieces of flight equipment washed up the next morning. Oxygen masks, pieces of uniform, things like that. Jake's mouth went dry. Did anyone ever photograph this man? Helen's eyes widened slightly. Why would you ask that specific question? Jake hesitated, then decided to trust his instincts. He pulled out the photograph and placed it carefully on the desk. Helen gasped and took a step backward. Sweet Mother of God, where did you find this? Washed up on the beach yesterday morning. You recognize him? I've seen this photograph before. Helen's voice was barely audible now. My father had one just like it. Said a tourist gave it to him in 1946, claimed he'd taken it of the man he saw on the beach, but my father destroyed it. Why? Because strange things started happening after he brought it home. Cold spots in the house, even in the middle of summer. Voices on the radio that weren't from any station. And at night, she shuddered. At night you could hear aircraft engines circling overhead, but there were never any planes. The same phenomena Jake had experienced at the motel. What happened to make your father destroy the photograph? One morning he found wet sand tracked all through the house, leading from the front door to where he kept the photograph. The sand was still damp, and it smelled like the ocean, but we lived 2 miles inland. That's when he decided the photograph was cursed. Helen examined Jake's photograph more closely, careful not to touch it. This one's in better condition than my father's was. His had water damage and was starting to fade. But the man's expression was exactly the same. That terrible fear. Did your father ever learn the man's identity? Not officially, but there were rumors. People said it was Lieutenant Charles Taylor, the flight leader of those lost bombers. The story was that his plane had crashed offshore, but somehow he'd survived and made it to land. Only something had gone wrong with him, like he wasn't entirely alive anymore. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. What do you mean, not entirely alive? The man people saw on the beaches, he cast no shadow. Even in bright daylight there was no shadow, and his footprints would fill with seawater even when he was walking on dry sand, far from the tide line. Helen moved around the desk and led Jake to a corner table stacked with local history books. I've collected every account I could find over the years. Not for publication, you understand, just for my own knowledge. Some of the old-timers are still alive, and they still won't talk about what they saw. She pulled out a manila folder thick with yellowed newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, and photocopied documents. The official story is that Flight 19 got lost due to compass malfunction and bad weather. But the locals know there was more to it. Strange weather patterns that day, electromagnetic disturbances that affected radio communications all along the coast. Jake opened the folder and began reading. The newspaper accounts from December 1945 were factual and dry, but the handwritten notes contained far more disturbing details. Multiple witnesses described seeing lights in the sky that moved in impossible patterns. Fishermen reported their compasses spinning wildly. Several people claimed their cars had stalled simultaneously as the strange lights passed overhead. This electromagnetic activity, Jake said, did it continue after the disappearance? For months, but it was concentrated around the areas where people reported seeing the pilot, almost like he was the center of it somehow. Jake found a detailed map in the folder, marked with red X's indicating sighting locations. They formed a rough circle around the coast of Islamorada, with the highest concentration of marks near the beach where he'd found the photograph. Helen, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Do you believe these sightings were real? The librarian was quiet for a long moment, staring at the photograph of Lieutenant Taylor. My father was a practical man. He didn't believe in ghosts or supernatural nonsense. But I saw what that photograph did to our house. I saw the fear in his eyes when he talked about the man on the beach. She looked directly at Jake. Whatever happened to Flight 19, it left something behind, something that's still here. As if summoned by her words, the lights in the library suddenly flickered. The air conditioning unit made a grinding noise and fell silent, leaving them in the oppressive heat. And from somewhere outside, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of aircraft engines beginning their eternal patrol. Helen waited until the phantom engines faded before speaking again, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the table. There's someone you need to talk to. Eddie Ramirez. He was a radio man at the Banana River Naval Air Station back in 1945. He's the one who took the last transmission from Flight 19. Jake looked up from the folder of clippings. He's still alive? 83 years old and sharp as a tack. Lives in a trailer park about 10 miles north of here. But I have to warn you, he doesn't like talking about that day. It took me years to get him to tell me even the basics. What did he tell you? Helen's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. That the last transmission wasn't what the official reports claimed. They said Lieutenant Taylor's final words were about being lost and disoriented, but Eddie heard something else entirely. Jake felt his stomach tighten. What kind of something else? Taylor was screaming. Not about being lost, but about something chasing them. Something that shouldn't exist. The air in the library felt thick and oppressive despite the returning hum of the air conditioner. Jake carefully placed the photograph back in his camera bag, suddenly aware that every time he looked at it, the phenomena seemed to intensify. 20 minutes later, Jake was driving through a maze of narrow roads lined with scrub pine and saw grass. The Sunset Palms trailer park was exactly what its name suggested, a collection of aging mobile homes arranged in neat rows under towering palm trees. He found Eddie Ramirez sitting on the aluminum steps of Unit 47, a weathered man with silver hair and intelligent dark eyes. "You the photographer Helen called about?" Eddie's voice carried the slight accent of someone who'd grown up speaking Spanish but had spent decades in the military. "Yes, sir. Jake Morrison. I understand you were involved with Flight 19. Eddie's expression hardened. "Involved is putting it mildly. I was the last person to have radio contact with those boys before they—" He gestured vaguely at the sky. "Before whatever happened to them happened. Helen said there were discrepancies between what you heard and what was officially reported." "Discrepancies?" Eddie laughed bitterly. "That's one way to put it. Come inside, son. This isn't a conversation for the neighbors." The trailer's interior was immaculate, filled with military memorabilia and photographs from Eddie's naval career. He poured 2 glasses of iced tea and sat across from Jake at a small dining table. "You want to know what really happened on December 5th, 1945? I'll tell you, but first I need to see whatever it is you found. Helen said you have a photograph." Jake hesitated, then removed the photograph from his bag. Eddie took one look at it and immediately pushed back from the table, his face pale. Jesus Christ Almighty, after all these years. He stared at the image with a mixture of fear and recognition. "That's Charlie Taylor, all right. But this picture," he shook his head, "this picture was taken after he disappeared. How can you be so certain?" Eddie pointed to details Jake hadn't noticed before. "Look at his flight suit. See those tears in the fabric, the way his hair is matted. Charlie was meticulous about his appearance. He'd never start a mission looking like that." Eddie's finger traced the air above the photograph, careful not to touch it. "And that compass he's holding, it's not standard Navy issue. That's an old aviator's compass, the kind they used in the Great War." "I don't understand. Neither did I, not for years. But I've had nearly 3 decades to think about what happened that day, and I've come to some conclusions that would get me laughed out of any VFW hall in the country." Eddie stood and walked to a window overlooking the trailer park's central courtyard. "The official story is that Flight 19 got lost due to equipment malfunction and ran out of fuel somewhere over the Atlantic, but that's not what I heard in their final transmissions." "What did you hear?" "Terror. Pure, absolute terror." Charlie Taylor was an experienced pilot, son. He'd flown combat missions over the Pacific, survived kamikaze attacks, seen things that would break most men. But in those last few minutes, his voice was like nothing I'd ever heard before. Eddie returned to the table and sat down, his eyes fixed on the photograph. He kept saying they were being followed, not by aircraft, but by something in the water, something huge that was keeping pace with them, no matter how fast they flew. Could it have been a whale? A submarine? That's what we thought at first, but Charlie described lights, geometric patterns moving beneath the surface, and then— Eddie's voice trailed off. "Then what?" "Then he said the water was rising, not like a wave, but like it was defying gravity, reaching up toward the aircraft, and his compass wasn't just malfunctioning, it was spinning like a top, pointing in directions that don't exist." Jake felt a familiar chill creeping into the trailer, despite the afternoon heat outside. What happened next? The transmission cut to static for about 30 seconds. Then Charlie's voice came back, but different, hollow, like he was speaking from the bottom of a well. He said, "We're not in the air anymore, we're not in the water, we're somewhere else entirely." Eddie's hands shook slightly as he continued. Those were his last coherent words. After that, it was just screaming and what sounded like metal tearing apart. Then silence. But search planes were dispatched immediately. If they'd crashed in the ocean, there would have been debris. There was debris, son, but not the kind you'd expect. Eddie walked to an old wooden chest and removed a small metal box. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a piece of twisted metal about the size of Jake's palm. This washed up on Cocoa Beach 3 days after the disappearance. It's aluminum from a Navy torpedo bomber. But look at it closely. Jake examined the metal fragment. It was unlike anything he'd ever seen, twisted into impossible shapes that hurt his eyes to follow. The surface showed signs of extreme heat damage, but also something else, a kind of corrosion that formed strange patterns across its surface. The metallurgists at the base couldn't explain it, Eddie said. The metal had been subjected to forces that shouldn't exist, twisted in ways that defied the laws of physics. And it was radioactive, giving off a low-level radiation that didn't match any known isotope. Did you report this? I tried, but by then the official story was already set in stone. Equipment failure, pilot error, lost at sea. Case closed. Anyone who suggested otherwise was quietly transferred or encouraged to retire early. Eddie carefully rewrapped the metal fragment and returned it to the box. But the strangest thing was what happened to me after I handled that piece of debris. I started having dreams, vivid dreams, where I was flying with Flight 19, experiencing everything they went through in their final moments. What kind of experiences? Flying through clouds that weren't made of water vapor, but something else entirely, seeing islands that appeared and disappeared, and always that thing in the water, following us, reaching up with tendrils of liquid that moved with intelligence and purpose. The temperature in the trailer had dropped noticeably, and Jake could see his breath forming small clouds in the suddenly frigid air. Eddie noticed it too, his eyes widening with alarm. "It's starting again," Eddie whispered. "Every time someone brings up Flight 19, especially with physical evidence like that photograph, they come looking." They? The crew. They never really died, son. They're still out there, still flying their patrol looking for a way home, but they can't find it on their own. They need help from the living. Outside, the unmistakable drone of aircraft engines began to build, circling the trailer park in a wide pattern. Other residents were stepping out of their homes, looking up at the empty sky with confused expressions. The phantom engines circled for nearly an hour before fading into silence, leaving Eddie and Jake sitting in the unnaturally cold trailer, neither man willing to speak until the temperature began to return to normal. When it was over, Eddie looked older, as if the encounter had drained years from his life. "They're getting stronger," Eddie said, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the lingering chill. "Each time someone makes contact with them, they become more present in our world. That photograph you found, it's like a beacon calling them home." Jake carefully tucked the photograph back into his camera bag. "What do they want?" "Same thing any lost souls want, to find their way back to where they belong. But the problem is, they don't belong anywhere anymore. They're caught between worlds, and every time they try to return to ours, they bring a little piece of that other place with them." "What other place?" Eddie walked to his kitchen window and stared out at the trailer park, where residents were still gathered in small groups, discussing the mysterious aircraft sounds. "I've had 28 years to think about this, and I've come to believe that Flight 19 didn't just crash. They flew into something, some kind of dimensional fold in space itself. The Bermuda Triangle isn't just a place where things disappear, son. It's a doorway." That evening, Jake returned to his motel room with a sense of growing dread. The photograph seemed to pulse with energy in his bag, and twice during the drive back, he'd glanced in his rearview mirror, expecting to see aircraft following him. The sky remained empty, but the sensation of being watched never left him. He spread Eddie's research materials across his bed, alongside Helen's folder of local accounts. The pattern was undeniable. Every few years, someone would find a piece of Flight 19 debris or report a sighting of the lost airman, and each incident would be followed by a wave of supernatural activity that gradually faded until the next discovery. But Jake's photograph was different. According to both Eddie and Helen, previous artifacts had been damaged, degraded by decades of exposure to seawater and weather. This photograph was in remarkable condition, as if it had been preserved by some unnatural force. As darkness fell over the Keys, Jake made a decision that he knew was probably foolish, but felt absolutely necessary. He was going to return to the beach where he'd found the photograph and see what happened after sunset. If the stories were true, if the lost airman really did walk the shores at night, Jake wanted to encounter him directly. He loaded fresh film into his camera and packed additional equipment, including a portable flash unit and a tape recorder. If he was going to document the supernatural, he wanted irrefutable evidence. The beach was eerily quiet at midnight, lit only by a crescent moon that cast long shadows across the sand. Jake set up his equipment near the spot where he'd discovered the photograph, then settled in to wait. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of waves and the distant hum of traffic on the overseas highway. At 12:47 a.m., the temperature began to drop. Jake watched his breath start to form clouds in the suddenly frigid air, and knew something was about to happen. He raised his camera and began taking photographs at regular intervals, the flash illuminating the beach in stark black and white moments. The footprints appeared first. In the viewfinder of his camera, Jake could see them clearly in the sand, perfectly preserved impressions of military boots, leading from the waterline toward the spot where he sat. But when he lowered the camera and looked with his naked eyes, the beach appeared empty and undisturbed. He continued shooting, following the invisible path of the footprints through his lens. They led in a straight line across the beach, then turned abruptly toward the ocean and disappeared at the tide line. Jake was examining the last clear print when he heard the voice. "Can you see me?" Jake spun around, his heart hammering. Standing 20 feet away, clearly visible now without the need for the camera, was Lieutenant Charles Taylor. He looked exactly as he had in the photograph, down to the terrified expression and the rusted compass clutched in his right hand. But in person, the supernatural nature of his presence was unmistakable. He cast no shadow despite the bright moonlight, and his flight suit moved in a breeze that Jake couldn't feel. "You're not supposed to be here," Jake managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "Neither are you." Taylor's voice sounded hollow, as if it was coming from a great distance. "But you found the photograph. You made the connection. Now you're part of it." "Part of what?" Taylor raised his left hand, and Jake could see that it was translucent, stars visible through the ghostly flesh. "The patrol. We've been flying the same mission for 28 years, looking for landmarks that don't exist anymore, following compass headings that lead nowhere. Why can't you rest?" "Because we never completed our mission. We were supposed to return to base, but we got lost in the space between spaces. Now we're trapped in an eternal holding pattern, waiting for someone to guide us home." Jake raised his camera instinctively, but Taylor shook his head. "No more photographs. Each image traps a piece of our essence in your world, makes it harder for us to find our way back to where we belong." "Then why did you leave the photograph for me to find?" "I didn't leave it. It was torn from me when I tried to cross over completely." Taylor moved closer, and Jake could feel the supernatural cold radiating from his form. "Every time someone from your world makes contact with us, we become more solid, more present. But it's a false presence. We don't belong in the realm of the living anymore." The sound of aircraft engines began to build in the distance, growing steadily louder. Taylor looked up at the sky with an expression of desperate longing. "They're coming for me. My squadron. We fly together now, forever lost, forever searching." He turned back to Jake, his eyes pleading. "You have to help us find peace. The photograph, the compass, they're anchors keeping us tied to this world. As long as they exist, we can never truly die. What do you want me to do? Destroy them, all of it. Every piece of Flight 19 that's ever been recovered, every photograph, every fragment of debris. Only then can we stop flying and finally rest." The aircraft engines were directly overhead now, invisible but unmistakably real. The sand around Jake's feet began to swirl in miniature whirlwinds, and the ocean itself seemed to glow with an unnatural phosphorescence. "But if I destroy the evidence," Jake shouted over the increasing noise, "no one will ever know what really happened to you." Taylor was already fading, becoming translucent as the Phantom Squadron called him back to their eternal patrol. "Some mysteries are meant to remain buried, son. Some doors should never be opened." As the ghostly airman disappeared completely, 5 distinct aircraft shadows passed over the beach, visible against the moon, despite the absence of any physical planes. The shadows circled once, twice, then headed out toward the open ocean, carrying their impossible cargo back to the realm between worlds. Jake stood alone on the beach, the photograph of Lieutenant Taylor burning like fire in his camera bag, and knew that his life had just become infinitely more complicated. Jake didn't sleep for the remainder of the night. He sat in his motel room, staring at the photograph of Lieutenant Taylor, while wrestling with an impossible decision. Destroy the evidence and potentially help tormented souls find peace, or preserve it and condemn them to eternal suffering. By dawn, he'd made up his mind to seek more information before taking any irreversible action. Helen had mentioned that other pieces of Flight 19 debris had been recovered over the years. If Jake was going to help the Phantom crew find rest, he needed to locate every artifact. But first, he had questions that only an expert could answer. Dr. Margaret Henley was a professor of parapsychology at the University of Florida, and, according to Helen's research notes, one of the few academics who took Bermuda Triangle phenomena seriously. Jake called her office at 8 a.m. and was surprised when she answered personally. "Dr. Henley, my name is Jake Morrison. I'm a photographer who's come across what I believe to be genuine supernatural artifacts related to Flight 19. I was hoping you might be willing to examine them." There was a long pause. "Mr. Morrison, I receive calls like this frequently. Most turn out to be hoaxes or misidentified objects. However, Flight 19 is a case I've been researching for over a decade. What exactly do you think you found?" Jake described the photograph and his encounters with the Phantom Airman. To his surprise, Dr. Henley didn't sound skeptical. "Can you be in Gainesville by this afternoon? I think there are things you need to see." 3 hours later, Jake was sitting in Dr. Henley's cluttered office in the university's psychology building. She was a woman in her 50s with graying hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Her office was filled with books on parapsychology, unexplained phenomena, and quantum physics. "Before you show me what you found," Dr. Henley said, "I want you to see something that might provide context." She led Jake to a climate-controlled storage room in the basement of the building. Along the walls were dozens of glass cases containing various artifacts, each carefully labeled and documented. Dr. Henley stopped in front of a case marked Flight 19, various locations, 1946 to 1973. Inside were more than 20 objects, pieces of twisted metal, fragments of flight suits, corroded instruments, and most disturbing of all, 3 additional photographs, nearly identical to the one Jake had. "Found? I've been collecting these for years," Dr. Henley explained. "Each one was found by a different person, in a different location, but always along the Florida Keys coastline, and each discovery was followed by the same pattern of supernatural activity you've described." Jake examined the photographs closely. All showed Lieutenant Taylor in the same terrified state, clutching the same rusted compass, but the backgrounds were subtly different. In one, he appeared to be standing in shallow water. In another, he was partially obscured by what looked like fog or mist. How is this possible? How can there be multiple photographs of the same moment? That's the question I've been trying to answer for 15 years. My theory is that these aren't photographs in the conventional sense. They're more like impressions, psychic recordings of Taylor's final moments, manifesting in physical form whenever the barrier between dimensions becomes thin. Dr. Henley moved to another case containing what appeared to be a ship's compass, heavily corroded and frozen at an impossible bearing. This was recovered from a fishing boat that disappeared off Key Largo in 1967. The boat was found 3 days later, completely intact, but abandoned. The crew was never seen again, but witnesses reported seeing 5 aircraft circling the area just before the disappearance. You think Flight 19 is still claiming victims? I think Flight 19 is trapped in a kind of temporal loop, doomed to repeat their final flight over and over. But sometimes the loop intersects with our reality, and when it does, people get pulled in. She gestured to a newspaper clipping pinned to a bulletin board. 17 documented disappearances in the past 28 years, all connected to Flight 19 artifact discoveries. Jake felt his blood turn cold. What happened to the people who found these items? Some simply vanished without a trace. Others were found days later, catatonic and unable to remember what happened to them. A few, like yourself, experienced supernatural contact and sought help. Dr. Henley's expression grew grave, but all of them reported the same thing in their final communications. They were being called to join the Eternal Patrol. Lieutenant Taylor told me that destroying the artifacts would free them. Was he telling the truth? Partially. The artifacts do serve as anchors, tying the lost crew to our reality. But destroying them randomly could have catastrophic consequences. If the psychic energy they contain is released improperly, it could tear open permanent rifts between dimensions. Dr. Henley led Jake to her desk and pulled out a thick folder marked Project Homecoming. Inside were detailed blueprints, mathematical equations, and what appeared to be ritual instructions. I've been working on a solution for years. Based on my research into quantum mechanics and parapsychology, I believe it's possible to create a controlled release of the psychic energy, essentially opening a doorway home for the lost souls. What would that involve? Gathering all known Flight 19 artifacts in one location at a specific time when the dimensional barriers are thinnest, then performing a ceremony designed to channel the trapped energy back to its source dimension. She looked directly at Jake. But it's dangerous. The person conducting the ceremony would need to serve as a conduit for the psychic energy. They might not survive the process. Jake studied the blueprints, trying to understand the complex diagrams. When would the barriers be thinnest? December 5th. The anniversary of the disappearance. Every year on that date, supernatural activity in the triangle reaches its peak. It's our best chance to send them home. That's 4 months away. which gives us time to locate the remaining artifacts. According to my research, there are still several pieces unaccounted for. But there's another problem. Dr. Henley's voice grew troubled. I'm not the only one who's been collecting Flight 19 artifacts. There's someone else. Someone who seems to have access to pieces that never made it into official reports. She pulled out a photograph of a man in his 60s, with silver hair and cold, calculating eyes. Richard Blackwood. He's a private collector of supernatural artifacts, completely obsessed with Flight 19. He owns a compound on a private island off Key West, where he's assembled what he claims is the most complete collection of triangle phenomena in the world. What does he want with them? Power. Blackwood believes that Flight 19 stumbled into a source of unlimited energy, a way to manipulate space and time itself. He's been trying to recreate their final flight, to follow them into whatever dimension they discovered. Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with supernatural activity. And if he succeeds, then he won't just be opening a door for Flight 19 to come home. He'll be opening it for whatever they found on the other side to come here. As if summoned by their conversation, the lights in Dr. Henley's office began to flicker. The temperature plummeted, and from somewhere in the building came the unmistakable sound of aircraft engines beginning their familiar circular pattern. They know we're talking about them, Dr. Henley whispered. And I think they're trying to warn us that we're running out of time. The phantom engines circled Dr. Henley's building for over 2 hours, growing more agitated with each pass. When they finally faded, she and Jake found themselves in her office surrounded by papers, scattered by an impossible wind, despite all the windows being closed. On her desk, frost had formed around the edges of the Flight 19 file, and the temperature readings on her instruments showed the room had dropped to 38 degrees. They're getting desperate, Dr. Henley said, gathering the scattered documents. The longer they remain trapped, the more unstable the dimensional barriers become. We need to act soon before Blackwood makes his move. Jake helped reorganize the files, noting that several photographs of artifacts now showed different images than they had an hour earlier. Lieutenant Taylor's expression seemed more anguished, his eyes more pleading. How do we get to Blackwood's island? And more importantly, how do we get past his security to examine his collection? Dr. Henley pulled out a marine chart of the waters around Key West. Blackwood owns Phantom Key, about 12 miles southwest of the main island. It's completely private, patrolled by armed guards, and officially doesn't exist on any government maps. She pointed to a small notation on the chart. But I have a contact who might help us. Captain Rosa Martinez runs charter fishing trips in those waters. More importantly, she's one of the few people who's actually been to Blackwood's compound and lived to tell about it. An hour later, Jake found himself sitting in a waterfront bar in Key West, nursing a beer while waiting for Captain Martinez. The Rusty Anchor was the kind of establishment that catered to charter boat captains, commercial fishermen, and tourists looking for authentic local color. The walls were decorated with fishing nets, mounted fish, and faded photographs of record catches. Captain Martinez turned out to be a woman in her 40s with sun-weathered skin and sharp, intelligent eyes. She slid into the booth across from Jake and ordered a rum and coke before getting down to business. Margaret Henley says you want to get to Phantom Key. That's either very brave or very stupid, and I haven't decided which yet. What can you tell me about Blackwood's operation? Officially, nothing. The man pays good money for discretion, and boat captains who talk too much about their clients don't stay in business long. She took a long drink, then continued. Unofficially, Richard Blackwood is completely insane, and his island is the closest thing to hell I've ever seen. Martinez leaned forward, lowering her voice. I took him and some of his people out there about 6 months ago. They had crates of equipment, scientific instruments, things I'd never seen before. But what bothered me wasn't the equipment. It was the way they talked about their work. What did they say? They kept referring to something called the convergence. From what I could piece together, they believe that certain locations in the triangle are natural focal points where multiple dimensions intersect. Blackwood's convinced that Flight 19 discovered one of these points, and that he can use their artifacts to access the same dimensional gateway. Jake felt his stomach tighten. Did you see any of the artifacts? More than I wanted to. Blackwood has them displayed in what he calls his museum, but it's more like a shrine. Pieces of aircraft personal effects, photographs, but the strangest thing was the centerpiece of his collection. Martinez paused, as if gathering courage to continue. It was a compass, but not like any compass I'd ever seen. It was ancient-looking, covered in symbols that hurt your eyes to look at directly, and it wasn't pointing north. The needle was spinning constantly, like it was trying to point to something that existed in multiple directions at once. The same compass from the photographs. Had to be. But here's the thing that really spooked me. While I was looking at it, I could swear I heard voices coming from inside the thing. Faint voices, like people calling for help from very far away. The temperature in the bar seemed to drop several degrees, and Jake noticed that his breath was beginning to form small clouds. Other patrons were starting to look around nervously, sensing something wrong but unable to identify the source. "There's more," Martinez continued, apparently oblivious to the supernatural chill. "Blackwood's island isn't natural. I mean, it started out as a small coral key, but he's been building on it for years. Underground levels, strange antenna arrays, equipment that generates electromagnetic fields so strong they interfere with navigation systems for miles around. What's he trying to accomplish? From what I overheard, he's attempting to recreate the exact conditions that Flight 19 encountered on December 5th, 1945. He believes that if he can generate the same electromagnetic anomalies at the same location where the original artifacts were recovered, he can open a permanent gateway to whatever dimension they accessed. The Phantom aircraft engines began to build outside, circling the bar with increasing intensity. Other patrons were getting up to look out the windows, confused by the sound of planes they couldn't see. "We need to get to that island," Jake said urgently. "If Blackwood succeeds in opening a permanent gateway, it could be catastrophic." Martinez nodded grimly. "I was afraid you'd say that, but there's something else you need to know. I wasn't the only charter captain who's taken people to Phantom Key. 3 others have made trips there over the past year. None of them came back. What happened to them? Officially, boating accidents lost at sea during routine charters, but the Coast Guard never found any wreckage, and all 3 disappearances happened on nights when people reported unusual lights over the water and Phantom aircraft in the sky." Jake pulled out the photograph of Lieutenant Taylor and placed it on the table. Martinez took one look at it and immediately pushed back from the booth. "Jesus Christ, where did you get that?" "Found it on a beach in Islamorada. Why?" "Because I've seen that exact photograph before. Blackwood has one just like it in his collection, but his was in much worse condition. Water damaged, fading. But the man's expression, the compass, everything was identical. The aircraft engines outside reached a crescendo, and the lights in the bar began to flicker violently. Through the windows, Jake could see other establishments along the waterfront experiencing the same electrical disturbances. "They're warning us," Jake said, understanding flooding over him. "The crew of Flight 19, they know what Blackwood is planning, and they're trying to tell us we're running out of time." Martinez stared at the photograph with growing horror. "You said you found this recently?" "Yesterday morning." "That's impossible. Blackwood's photograph disappeared from his collection 3 days ago. His security footage shows it simply vanishing from its display case, like it had never been there." Jake felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. The artifacts aren't just connected to Flight 19, they're connected to each other. When one moves, the others respond. "Which means," Martinez said, her voice barely audible above the Phantom engines, "that if you have one of the photographs, Blackwood knows exactly where you are." As if summoned by her words, the bar's front door opened and 2 men in expensive suits entered. They scanned the room with the practiced eyes of professional security operatives before their gaze settled on Jake's table. "Mr. Morrison?" The larger of the 2 men approached with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Blackwood would very much like to meet with you. He has a proposition regarding certain artifacts you've recently acquired." Jake's hand instinctively moved toward his camera bag, but the larger man shook his head with that same cold smile. "I wouldn't recommend any sudden movements, Mr. Morrison. Mr. Blackwood is a reasonable man, but his patience has limits, especially when it comes to Flight 19 artifacts." Captain Martinez had gone pale, her knuckles white as she gripped her rum and coke. The Phantom aircraft engines outside were growing more agitated, circling the bar in tighter and tighter patterns that made the windows rattle in their frames. "What does Blackwood want?" Jake asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "A simple exchange of information. You have something he needs, and he has something you need. A mutually beneficial arrangement." The second man, who had been scanning the bar's other patrons, stepped closer to their table. "The photograph, Mr. Morrison. We know you have it. Our employer has been tracking its psychic signature since it manifested 3 days ago." Jake realized there was no point in denying it. Blackwood clearly had resources and knowledge far beyond what he'd initially assumed. "And what does he have that I need?" "Answers. The truth about what happened to Flight 19, And more importantly, what's going to happen if the current dimensional instabilities aren't resolved soon? Martinez leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. Don't trust him, Jake. Whatever Blackwood is offering, it's not worth the price he'll demand. The larger man's expression hardened. Captain Martinez, isn't it? I believe you've been to Phantom Key before. You should understand better than most that Mr. Blackwood doesn't make idle threats. The temperature in the bar plummeted another 10 degrees, and several patrons near the windows began pointing at the sky in confusion. Through the glass, Jake could see the unmistakable shadows of aircraft passing overhead, visible against the streetlights despite the absence of any physical planes. They're getting stronger, the second man observed, checking a device that looked like a modified electromagnetic field detector. The convergence is accelerating. Mr. Blackwood's calculations suggest we have less than 72 hours before the dimensional barriers collapse completely. What happens then? Jake asked. Chaos. The realm that Flight 19 accessed isn't empty, Mr. Morrison. It's inhabited by entities that have been trying to break through to our dimension for decades. The lost squadron has been acting as an inadvertent barrier, their psychic energy sealing the rift. But that seal is weakening. The first man checked his watch. Mr. Blackwood's helicopter is waiting at the marina. I suggest we don't keep him waiting any longer. Jake looked at Martinez, who gave him an almost imperceptible nod. She was right that this was dangerous, but he was also beginning to understand that he might not have a choice. If Blackwood's timeline was accurate, they were facing a catastrophe that made personal safety irrelevant. What about Captain Martinez? She can come if she wishes, Mr. Blackwood values her expertise with local waters, but the invitation is non-negotiable for you, Mr. Morrison. 20 minutes later, Jake found himself strapped into a luxury helicopter flying southwest over the darkening waters of the Florida Straits. Martinez sat across from him, her face grim as she watched the lights of Key West fade behind them. The two security men flanked them, their weapons clearly visible under their suit jackets. As they flew, Jake noticed something disturbing about the water below. In several locations, the ocean was glowing with an unnatural phosphorescence that formed geometric patterns on the surface. The patterns pulsed rhythmically, as if responding to some unseen signal. Dimensional bleed-through, one of the security men explained, noticing Jake's attention. It's been increasing exponentially over the past month. Mr. Blackwood believes we're approaching a critical threshold. Phantom Key appeared on the horizon, as a cluster of lights that seemed too bright and too organized for a natural island. As they drew closer, Jake could see that Martinez had been right about the artificial construction. The original Coral Key had been expanded with concrete and steel into a complex that resembled a high-tech research facility more than a private residence. The helicopter set down on a landing pad built out over the water on steel pylons. As they disembarked, Jake was struck by the oppressive atmosphere of the place. The air itself felt thick and charged with electricity, and his skin tingled as if he were standing too close to a powerful generator. Richard Blackwood was waiting for them at the entrance to the main building. He was exactly as Dr. Henley had described him, a man in his 60s with silver hair and cold, calculating eyes. But in person, there was something else about him that made Jake's skin crawl, an intensity that bordered on madness. Mr. Morrison, welcome to Phantom Key. I trust your flight was comfortable. Blackwood's voice was cultured, with just a hint of a British accent. I apologize for the somewhat dramatic nature of your invitation, but time is a luxury we no longer possess. They entered the building through a security airlock that scanned them with multiple types of sensors. The interior was a bizarre combination of luxury furnishing and high-tech laboratory equipment. Electromagnetic field generators hummed in the walls, and the air was filled with the subtle scent of ozone. Before we discuss business, Blackwood said, leading them down a corridor lined with display cases, I'd like to show you my collection. I believe it will provide context for what we're facing. The museum was more extensive than Jake had imagined. Dozens of artifacts were arranged in climate-controlled cases, each one labeled with detailed documentation. Pieces of aircraft wreckage, corroded instruments, fragments of flight suits, and most disturbingly personal effects that looked far too well preserved for items that had supposedly spent decades underwater. But it was the centerpiece that made Jake's breath catch in his throat. In the center of the room, displayed on a pedestal under specialized lighting, was the compass from Lieutenant Taylor's photograph. But seeing it in person was entirely different from seeing it in the image. The artifact seemed to pulse with its own malevolent energy, and the symbols carved into its surface shifted and writhed as if they were alive. Beautiful, isn't it? Blackwood said, noting Jake's fascination. This compass is the key to everything. It's not just a navigational instrument, Mr. Morrison. It's a dimensional anchor, a device that can lock onto specific points in space-time. Martinez moved closer to the display case, her expression troubled. This wasn't here when I visited before. Where did you get it? It came to me, Captain Martinez. Just as Mr. Morrison's photograph came to him, the artifacts choose their guardians based on need and circumstance. Blackwood's eyes gleamed with an unsettling intensity. The question is, what do they need us to do? Jake pulled out his photograph and placed it on a nearby table. The moment it made contact with the surface, every piece of equipment in the museum began to emit a high-pitched whine, and the temperature dropped so rapidly that frost formed on the display cases. Remarkable, Blackwood whispered. The psychic resonance is off the charts. Your photograph is the missing piece, Mr. Morrison. With it, I can complete the convergence array and open a stable pathway to the realm beyond. And what exactly is in this realm beyond? Jake demanded. Blackwood's smile was genuinely terrifying. Power, Mr. Morrison. Unimaginable power. The ability to manipulate space and time itself. The entities that inhabit that dimension have been waiting for someone with the courage to join them. Through the museum's windows, Jake could see lights moving beneath the water around the island, geometric patterns that pulsed in synchronization with the compass. Whatever Blackwood was doing, it was already affecting the dimensional barriers. The crew of Flight 19, Jake said. They're trying to prevent this, aren't they? They're not lost souls looking for peace. They're guardians trying to keep something imprisoned. Blackwood nodded approvingly. Very good. Yes, Lieutenant Taylor and his men have been serving as unwitting sentries for nearly 3 decades, but their psychic energy is finite and it's running out. When it does, the barrier will fall regardless of what we do. So you're going to accelerate the process. I'm going to control it. Rather than allow chaos, I'm going to open the gateway on my terms, establish communication with the entities beyond, and secure humanity's place in a larger cosmic order. The museum was filled with the sound of phantom aircraft engines now, circling the building in an increasingly frantic pattern. Outside, the ocean itself seemed to be responding, with waves forming impossible spirals around the island. They're here, Blackwood said with satisfaction. The final convergence has begun. The phantom aircraft engines circling Blackwood's compound grew so loud that Jake had to raise his voice to be heard over the supernatural din. Through the museum's reinforced windows, he could see the ocean around Phantom Key beginning to glow with an otherworldly light that pulsed in rhythm with the ancient compass. The dimensional barriers are thinning rapidly, Blackwood announced, consulting a bank of monitors that displayed electromagnetic readings unlike anything Jake had ever seen. We have perhaps 2 hours before the convergence reaches critical mass. Martinez grabbed Jake's arm, her grip tight with fear. We need to get off this island, now. But Blackwood's security men had positioned themselves at the exits, their weapons drawn. The collector himself seemed oblivious to the danger, mesmerized by the readings on his instruments. There's no escape, Captain Martinez. The electromagnetic field surrounding the island makes air or sea travel impossible until the convergence is complete. We're all committed to this course of action now. Jake studied the ancient compass more carefully, noting details that hadn't been visible in the photograph. The symbols carved into its surface weren't random markings, but formed complex geometric patterns that seemed to shift and flow like living things. More disturbing, he could swear he heard faint voices emanating from within the device, multiple voices speaking in languages he didn't recognize. The compass isn't from our world, Jake realized aloud. Flight 19 found it wherever they went, and it followed them back. Precisely, Blackwood confirmed. It's a navigation device, but not for traveling between locations in our dimension. It points to rifts in space-time, tears in the fabric of reality itself. Lieutenant Taylor's squadron accidentally activated it during their final flight. The temperature in the museum plummeted another 20 degrees, and frost began forming on every surface. But now Jake could see shapes moving within the frost patterns, geometric forms that resembled the symbols on the compass. The entities from the other dimension, Jake said, they're not benevolent, are they? Flight 19 wasn't just lost, they were taken, and now they're trapped, forced to serve as barriers between our worlds. Blackwood's expression grew contemplative. Benevolent and malevolent are human concepts, Mr. Morrison. These entities operate according to different principles entirely. They see reality as we see a painting, something to be altered and reshaped according to their aesthetic preferences. Through the windows, Jake could see lights rising from beneath the ocean, massive geometric forms that defied the laws of physics as they moved through the water. Each form was the size of a city block, covered in the same shifting symbols as the compass. "My God," Martinez whispered. "What are those things?" "Cities," Blackwood replied with wonder in his voice. "Entire civilizations that exist in the spaces between dimensions. They've been watching our world for millennia, waiting for an opportunity to establish contact." The Phantom aircraft engines suddenly changed pitch, becoming more urgent and desperate. Jake could hear individual voices now, rising above the mechanical noise. Lieutenant Taylor's voice was clearest among them. "Don't let him complete the ritual. The compass is a trap, a beacon that calls them home. If the barrier falls completely, they won't just make contact. They'll reshape our entire reality to match their realm." Blackwood heard the voices too, but his interpretation was entirely different. "They're welcoming us, inviting us to join them in a higher form of existence. Think of it, Mr. Morrison. No more limitations of physical law, no more boundaries between thought and reality." Jake's photograph began to glow with its own inner light, and Lieutenant Taylor's image seemed to move within the frame. The ghostly airman was trying to communicate something urgent, pointing repeatedly at the compass and shaking his head. "He's warning us," Jake said. "Whatever these entities are, Taylor and his crew have seen what they do to reality. That's why they've been fighting to keep the barrier intact." "They're afraid," Blackwood dismissive replied. "Afraid of change, of evolution. But evolution requires adaptation, even if it means leaving behind everything we once were." The collector moved to a control panel and began entering commands. Around the room, hidden machinery came to life, generating electromagnetic fields that made the air itself shimmer like heat waves. The compass responded immediately, its needle spinning faster, and the symbols on its surface glowing with increasing intensity. "The convergence array is fully operational," Blackwood announced. "Mr. Morrison, if you would place your photograph on the pedestal next to the compass, we can begin the final phase." "And if I refuse?" Blackwood nodded to his security men, who raised their weapons. "Then Captain Martinez will die, and I'll take the photograph from your corpse. The choice is yours, but the outcome is inevitable." Jake looked at Martinez, seeing his own fear reflected in her eyes, but he also saw something else. Determination. She gave him the slightest nod, and he understood. She had a plan. "All right," Jake said, moving slowly toward the pedestal. "But I want to understand exactly what's going to happen." "Simple," Blackwood explained, his attention fixed on the monitoring equipment. "The photograph serves as a psychic anchor, connecting our reality to the dimensional rift. When combined with the compass's navigation matrix, it will create a stable portal between worlds." Jake placed the photograph next to the compass, and the reaction was immediate. Lightning arced between the two artifacts, and the temperature dropped so rapidly that the museum's windows began to crack from thermal shock. The shapes beneath the ocean grew larger and more distinct, rising toward the surface with impossible grace. But Martinez had been ready for this moment. As Blackwood's attention was completely focused on his instruments, she grabbed a fire axe from an emergency case and brought it down on the main power coupling for the convergence array. Sparks exploded from the severed cables, and the electromagnetic field generators began to shut down in sequence. The compass's glow immediately dimmed, and the photograph's psychic emanations flickered like a dying flame. "You fool!" Blackwood screamed, spinning toward Martinez. "You've doomed us all. Without the controlled convergence, the barrier will collapse chaotically. The entities won't establish communication. They'll simply overwrite our reality with their own." The security men moved to restrain Martinez, but the building was shaking now as dimensional forces raged out of control. Through the cracking windows, Jake could see the ocean around Phantom Key beginning to boil, as massive forms breached the surface. The Phantom aircraft engines reached a crescendo of desperation, and Lieutenant Taylor's voice rose above the chaos. "The ritual is reversed. Instead of opening the door, we can seal it permanently, but someone has to complete the circuit." Jake understood immediately. The photograph and compass weren't just artifacts, they were components in a dimensional lock, but the lock needed a human consciousness to activate it, someone willing to serve as a living key. "What he's saying," Jake shouted over the increasing chaos, "is that someone has to join Flight 19's Eternal Patrol. Someone has to take Lieutenant Taylor's place as Guardian." Blackwood's eyes gleamed with a mixture of terror and fascination as he realized the implications. Outside, the geometric city forms were fully visible now, their alien architecture defying every law of physics as they prepared to merge with our reality. The choice was clear. Let the entities reshape the world according to their incomprehensible design, or sacrifice himself to maintain the barrier between dimensions. As the museum's windows finally shattered and otherworldly energy began pouring into the room, Jake reached for both artifacts simultaneously. "Tell my story," he called to Martinez as dimensional lightning began to arc around him. "Make sure people know what really happened to Flight 19. The moment Jake's hands made contact with both the photograph and the compass, reality exploded around him. The museum, Phantom Key, the very concept of physical space, dissolved into a kaleidoscope of impossible geometries and shifting dimensions. He felt himself falling through layers of existence, each one more alien than the last. Then suddenly he was standing on the deck of a World War II torpedo bomber, flying through clouds that weren't made of water vapor, but of pure thought and memory. Lieutenant Charles Taylor stood beside him, no longer the terrified figure from the photograph, but a weary guardian bearing the weight of decades. "You felt the call," Taylor said, his voice clear for the first time, without the distortion of dimensional interference. "Few living souls can hear it, and fewer still are willing to answer." Around them, the other 4 aircraft of Flight 19 maintained perfect formation, their crews visible through transparent canopies. All 14 men looked exactly as they had on December 5, 1945, but their eyes held the wisdom of those who had seen beyond the boundaries of normal existence. "How long have you been fighting this war?" Jake asked, amazed that he could speak normally in this impossible realm. "Time doesn't work the same way here. It's been 28 years in your world, but for us, it's been both an instant and an eternity. We've been holding the line between dimensions, preventing the entities from breaking through completely." Through the translucent floor of the aircraft, Jake could see the geometric city forms that had risen from the ocean around Phantom Key, but from this vantage point, he could perceive their true nature. They weren't cities at all, but vast organisms that fed on reality itself, consuming entire dimensions and converting them into extensions of their own alien existence. "They're not evil in any sense we'd understand," Taylor explained, following Jake's gaze. "They're simply incompatible with our form of reality. If they fully manifest in our dimension, they won't destroy humanity so much as rewrite the fundamental laws that allow humanity to exist. And you've been stopping them single-handedly for 3 decades. Not single-handedly. The compass chooses its guardians, and each guardian's sacrifice strengthens the barrier. But our psychic energy is finite. We've been slowly fading, and when we're gone completely, nothing will stand between the entities and your world." Jake could see the truth of Taylor's words in the increasing transparency of the Phantom Squadron. The aircraft themselves were beginning to lose cohesion, their metal frames becoming gossamer thin as the crew's life force was exhausted. "That's why you left the photograph for me to find. You were looking for a replacement." "Not a replacement," Taylor corrected. "A completion." The ritual Blackwood interrupted was designed to seal the dimensional rift permanently, but it requires a conscious choice from someone in the living world, someone willing to serve as the final lock. Through the aircraft's windows, Jake could see Martinez fighting desperately to escape Phantom Key as the island was consumed by dimensional chaos. Blackwood's compound was collapsing into itself as reality warped around the convergence point, and the Collector himself was screaming orders at his security team, even as otherworldly energies began to transform them into geometric patterns. "If I complete the ritual, what happens to them? The dimensional rift will be sealed, the entities will be forced back to their own realm, and reality will stabilize. But you'll be trapped here with us, maintaining the barrier for as long as consciousness exists." Jake felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Save the world by condemning himself to an eternity as a dimensional guardian, or allow incomprehensible alien forces to reshape reality according to their inhuman design. But as he watched Martinez struggling against the chaos below, he realized the choice had already been made. Some responsibilities transcended personal survival. "How do I complete the ritual?" Taylor smiled, and for the first time since Jake had encountered him, the expression held genuine warmth instead of terror. "Take the compass, accept its guidance willingly, become the anchor that holds both worlds in their proper places." Jake reached for the ancient navigational device, and the moment his fingers closed around it, he felt the full weight of dimensional forces flowing through him. The compass wasn't just pointing to rifts in space-time, it was actively holding them closed, using the consciousness of its bearer as a stabilizing force. The photograph, Taylor continued, serves as your connection to the living world. As long as it exists, you'll maintain some link to the realm you're protecting. Without it, you'd lose yourself completely in the spaces between dimensions. Jake understood. The photograph wasn't just evidence of supernatural contact. It was a lifeline, a way for the Guardians to remember what they were fighting to preserve. Will I be able to communicate with the living world? Occasionally, when the barriers are thin, when someone makes genuine contact with Flight 19 phenomena, but mostly, you'll exist in the spaces between seconds, in the pauses between heartbeats, watching and waiting. The geometric entities were pressing closer now, their alien architecture beginning to merge with the physical structures of Phantom Key. Jake could see reality bending around them as they prepared to establish a permanent foothold in our dimension. "I'm ready," Jake said, gripping the compass tightly. "Tell me what to do. Think of everyone you're saving, everyone who will live and love and dream because you chose to stand guard. Let that knowledge become part of the barrier itself." Jake closed his eyes and thought of Martinez, of Dr. Henley, of Helen the librarian, of Eddie Ramirez with his decades of unanswered questions. He thought of millions of people who would never know how close they'd come to having their reality rewritten by forces beyond comprehension. The compass grew warm in his hands, then hot, then began to burn with a cold fire that seared his consciousness without damaging his flesh. He felt himself expanding, becoming something more and less than human, transforming into a living seal between worlds. "Thank you," Lieutenant Taylor said, his voice already beginning to fade as the burden of guardianship passed to Jake. "The watch is yours now. Guard it well." The last thing Jake saw before the transformation completed was Martinez's boat pulling away from the collapsing Phantom Key, carrying her towards safety, as the dimensional rift sealed itself with a sound like reality itself, sighing in relief. Then there was only the eternal patrol, the endless vigilance, and the knowledge that some sacrifices echo across dimensions, protecting worlds that will never know the names of their guardians. Captain Rosa Martinez sat in the Key West Coast Guard station, wrapped in a thermal blanket despite the Florida heat, recounting her story for the third time to increasingly skeptical officials. The explosion at Phantom Key had been visible from 30 miles away, a pillar of light that had briefly turned night into day before collapsing in on itself and leaving nothing but empty water where Blackwood's compound had stood. "Ma'am, I understand you've been through a traumatic experience," Coast Guard Commander Patricia Wells said with practiced patience, "but your account of dimensional rifts and alien entities isn't consistent with the physical evidence we've recovered." Martinez looked through the station's windows at the harbor, where search and rescue boats were returning from their fruitless mission to find survivors from the destroyed island. "What physical evidence have you found?" "Debris consistent with a catastrophic structural failure and explosion. Chemical residue suggesting experimental energy research, but nothing that supports claims of supernatural phenomena." "And Jake Morrison?" Commander Wells consulted her clipboard. "No trace of Mr. Morrison has been found. We're treating this as a missing person case, but given the scope of the destruction, we're not optimistic about finding survivors." Martinez knew they wouldn't find Jake, not in any way they'd recognize, but she also knew he wasn't truly gone. During her desperate escape from Phantom Key, she'd seen impossible things, felt the dimensional barriers shifting and reforming around her. And in the final moments before the island vanished, she'd glimpsed something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. 5 aircraft silhouettes against the pillar of light, flying in perfect formation as they disappeared into whatever realm existed beyond normal space-time. But there had been 6 shadows, not 5. Jake had joined Flight 19's Eternal Patrol, becoming the guardian that would hold the dimensional barriers in place. 3 days later, Martinez found herself back in the Rusty Anchor, nursing a whiskey and trying to process what she'd experienced. The other patrons gave her a wide berth, sensing the haunted look in her eyes. She'd aged years in the span of a single night, and everyone who looked at her could tell she'd seen things that human minds weren't meant to process. Dr. Margaret Henley arrived as the sun was setting, her face grave as she slid into the booth across from Martinez. The professor looked exhausted, as if she'd spent the past 72 hours without sleep. "The dimensional readings have stabilized," Dr. Henley said without preamble. "Whatever Jake did, it worked. The electromagnetic anomalies throughout the Triangle region have dropped to their lowest levels in recorded history. So it's over. The immediate crisis, yes, but Jake's sacrifice has created a new equilibrium. He's become something like a living seal, using his consciousness to maintain the barriers between dimensions. Martinez took a long drink of whiskey, feeling it burn away some of the supernatural chill that had settled in her bones. Will we ever see him again? Possibly. The previous Guardians, Flight 19, occasionally manifested in our reality when the barriers were thin. If Jake maintains some connection to our world, he might be able to communicate under the right circumstances. As if summoned by their conversation, the temperature in the bar began to drop. Other patrons started looking around nervously as their breath became visible in the suddenly frigid air. But Martinez felt no fear, only a profound sadness. "He's here," she whispered. Dr. Henley pulled out an electromagnetic field detector, watching its readings spike beyond the instrument's maximum range. "The psychic resonance is incredible. He's trying to communicate." Through the bar's windows, Martinez could see lights moving beneath the water in the harbor, geometric patterns that pulsed in a slow, steady rhythm. But these weren't the aggressive, reality-warping forms they'd seen at Phantom Key. These lights felt peaceful, protective. A faint voice, barely audible above the normal sounds of the waterfront bar, reached their table. Jake's voice, but changed, echoing as if it were coming from a vast distance. "Tell them the truth. Tell them about Flight 19, about the Guardians who stand watch between worlds. Make sure the story survives." Martinez nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I will. I promise." The temperature in the bar began to return to normal, and the lights beneath the water faded gradually, leaving only the ordinary illumination of harbor navigation beacons. But Martinez knew Jake was still out there, somewhere in the spaces between dimensions, maintaining his vigil over a world that would never know his name. Dr. Henley carefully packed away her instruments. "There's something else you should know. Blackwood's collection wasn't completely destroyed in the dimensional collapse. Several artifacts survived, scattered across the seafloor around where Phantom Key used to be. Will they cause more problems? Not as long as Jake maintains the dimensional seal, but we need to monitor the area, watch for signs of instability, and if other artifacts surface, we need to be prepared to contain them safely." Martinez finished her whiskey and stood to leave. "Where will you go now?" "Back to the university. I have reports to write, research to compile. The official version will focus on Blackwood's illegal energy experiments and the resulting explosion. But I'll make sure the real story is preserved, hidden in academic papers and research archives, where future generations might find it if they need it." As Martinez walked toward the harbor where her boat was moored, she thought about Jake's final words. Tell them the truth. Make sure the story survives. She would honor that promise, even knowing that most people would dismiss her account as the trauma-induced fantasies of a woman who'd been through too much. But some people would believe. Others who'd encountered the unexplained, who'd felt the touch of forces beyond normal understanding. They would recognize the truth in her words and pass the story along, ensuring that somewhere in the collective memory of humanity, the sacrifice of Jake Morrison and the crew of Flight 19 would endure. The harbor was quiet as Martinez untied her boat and prepared to return to the endless Florida waters where she made her living. But as she started the engine and pulled away from the dock, she could swear she heard the distant drone of aircraft engines, circling protectively in the darkness above. The guardian angels of the Bermuda Triangle were still on patrol, standing watch over a world they could no longer truly inhabit, ensuring that the barriers between dimensions remained sealed. And somewhere among them flew Jake Morrison, the photographer, who'd answered a call that echoed across space and time, joining the eternal vigil that kept humanity safe from forces beyond imagination. 1 year later, Helen Vasquez carefully placed the newly bound manuscript into the climate-controlled archive section of the Islamorada Public Library. The title page read, "The True Account of Flight 19, as told by those who witnessed the final convergence." It was based on extensive interviews with Captain Rosa Martinez and Dr. Margaret Henley, supplemented by decades of research into local supernatural phenomena. Helen knew that most people who found the manuscript would dismiss it as elaborate fiction, but she also knew that wasn't the point. The story would be there for those who needed it, for future researchers who encountered similar phenomena, for anyone who felt the touch of forces beyond normal understanding. The anniversary of Jake Morrison's disappearance had passed quietly, marked only by a small memorial service, attended by the few people who knew what had really happened. Martinez had spoken about Jake's courage, his willingness to sacrifice himself for strangers he would never meet. Dr. Henley had presented her scientific analysis of the dimensional crisis and its resolution, and Eddie Ramirez, the old radio man, had finally found peace, knowing that Flight 19's long vigil was complete. As Helen locked the archive case, she noticed the temperature in the library dropping slightly. Not the dramatic plunge that had marked active supernatural encounters, but a gentle cooling that felt almost like a caress. She wasn't surprised when she heard the faint sound of aircraft engines in the distance, barely audible above the usual sounds of Key's traffic. "Thank you," she whispered to the empty library, knowing that somewhere in the spaces between worlds, guardians were listening. 3,000 miles away, National Geographic editor Robert Cameron sat in his Manhattan office, staring at the final photographs Jake Morrison had taken before his disappearance. The images were beautiful, capturing the pristine wilderness of the Florida Keys with the kind of artistic vision that had made Jake one of their most valued photographers. But there was something else in the photographs, something Cameron couldn't quite identify. Subtle anomalies in the lighting, shadows that fell in impossible directions, and in one image what looked like aircraft silhouettes visible against the clouds, despite the fact that Jake had been photographing a completely different subject. Cameron had tried to contact Jake numerous times, but the photographer had simply vanished without a trace. The official Coast Guard report mentioned an explosion at a private research facility, but offered no concrete answers about Jake's fate. All Cameron had left were these final photographs, and a growing certainty that his friend had stumbled into something far beyond a routine nature assignment. He made a decision that would have seemed absurd to anyone who didn't know Jake Morrison personally. The photographs would be published, but with a dedication that might help preserve Jake's memory, in honor of those who stand watch in places we cannot see, protecting worlds we cannot imagine. Dr. Etai. Henley continued her research from her university office, monitoring electromagnetic readings throughout the Bermuda Triangle region and documenting the unprecedented stability that had followed the Phantom Key incident. Her academic papers, carefully worded to avoid supernatural explanations, nevertheless provided a detailed record of the dimensional crisis and its resolution. She maintained correspondence with Martinez, who had become an unofficial guardian of the waters, around where Phantom Key once stood. The captain reported occasional sightings of unusual lights beneath the surface, but they were peaceful now, protective rather than threatening. Local fishermen had begun to speak of the area as blessed, a place where storms seemed to weaken and dangerous weather patterns dissolve. On quiet nights, when the electromagnetic readings showed subtle fluctuations that indicated thinning dimensional barriers, both women could hear them. The phantom engines of Flight 19, now joined by a sixth aircraft, flying their eternal patrol through skies that existed between heartbeats and in the pauses between thoughts. Martinez had kept her promise to Jake, telling his story to anyone willing to listen. Most dismissed her account as the fantasies of a woman traumatized by a maritime disaster, but some believed. Other sailors, pilots who'd experienced unexplained phenomena, researchers into paranormal activity. The story spread through underground networks of believers, ensuring that somewhere in the collective unconscious of humanity, the truth would survive. Eddie Ramirez passed away peacefully in his sleep, 6 months after the Phantom Key incident, finally free from the decades of nightmares that had plagued him since that December day in 1945. His funeral was attended by dozens of former servicemen who'd carried their own secrets about Flight 19, men who'd been sworn to silence by military protocol, but had never forgotten what they'd witnessed. At the funeral, Martinez spoke about Eddie's role in preserving the truth about Flight 19's fate. She didn't mention dimensional rifts or alien entities, but she made it clear that the old radio man had been a guardian of secrets that mattered more than most people could imagine. As years passed, the story of Flight 19 and Jake Morrison's sacrifice became legend, passed down through networks of believers and researchers into unexplained phenomena. The dimensional barriers remained stable, the electromagnetic anomalies stayed at their lowest recorded levels, and the waters of the Bermuda Triangle became among the safest shipping lanes in the Atlantic. But on certain nights, when conditions were just right and the barriers between worlds grew thin, people still reported seeing lights in the sky. 6 aircraft flying in perfect formation, their engines audible but their forms visible only as shadows against the stars. Pilots radioed in sightings of ghost planes that appeared on radar for brief moments before vanishing completely. Ships' crews spoke of protective spirits that guided them through dangerous weather. The Guardians were still on patrol, still standing watch between dimensions, ensuring that humanity could sleep safely while forces beyond imagination pressed against the barriers that kept them at bay. Flight 19 had found their way home at last, not to the world they'd left behind, but to a purpose greater than any single life or death. And somewhere among them flew Jake Morrison, the photographer who'd answered a call that echoed across space and time, his camera replaced by an ancient compass that pointed not to magnetic north, but to the thin places in reality where vigilance was needed most. The story would survive because it had to survive, because there would always be those who needed to know that in the darkest hours, when forces beyond understanding threatened everything humanity held dear, there were guardians standing watch in the spaces between worlds. The truth about Flight 19 was finally complete, not with their disappearance or their decades-long imprisonment, but with their transformation into something greater than they had ever been in life. They had become legends in the truest sense, myths that carried the weight of absolute reality, protecting a world that would never fully understand the magnitude of their sacrifice. And in the end, perhaps that was enough.